Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Seal's Pledge by Cora Seton, narrated by Noah Michael Levine. Chapter 1. The 11th of July dawned warm and still, and Harris Wentworth, only 2 months out of a 16-year stint with the Navy SEALs, knew a storm was brewing. He woke early, like he always did, but for once he was the only one up in base camp. All the men in the small tent community were ex-SEALs. All of them had served until recently. They were a vigilant, early-rising bunch. Usually. Today would be an exception, Harris knew. Last night, they'd celebrated the marriage of Clay Pickett and Nora Ridgway, a wedding that could have as easily been a funeral. A stalker had followed Nora from Baltimore, where she used to teach high school, here to Chance Creek, Montana. He'd gotten Nora alone and nearly killed her before Clay managed to track her down. He'd nearly killed Clay's father in his attempt to shoot Clay, too. It had been touch and go there for a while with Nora, so her recovery and marriage had given everyone a lot of reasons to make toasts and drink to the newlyweds last night. Champagne, wine, beer, and mixed drinks had flowed, and as Harris got up and dressed, he could hear snoring from several of the tents around his. So far, they'd only managed to build 2 permanent homes in the community, the tiny house Boone Rudman and his wife Riley had moved into last month, and the one that Clay and Nora had moved into last night. There'd be more, though. One of them would be his, just as soon as he was married, too. The wedded couples got first dibs, and it wasn't his turn yet. He'd have to be patient. Luckily, Harris was good at that. He knew most of the men who'd joined the small community had come because of their dedication to sustainability, because they wanted to get the word out to the wider world there was a different way to live, one that saw humans acting as stewards of the planet's finite resources. Harris believed that, too, and he was proud of the work he was doing here, helping to build the tiny houses. But that wasn't the reason he decided to join up. He could still remember the ad he'd answered back in April. Boone had posted it on a private online forum for Navy SEALs. It had been succinct. 6 men needed to join planned eco-community, must be knowledgeable about sustainability, committed to the goals of our organization, comfortable with being filmed for a reality television show documenting our progress, and willing to marry within the year. Wives provided for those lacking them. Harris would never admit that, while he was all for sustainability, it was that last line that had jolted him into action. Wives provided. Harris wanted a wife badly. But while he'd received medals for bravery, commitment, and his sharpshooting skills, he would never be commended for his ability to talk to women. He tried now and then. Truth was, he was a doer, not a talker, and his dates had a depressing tendency to start off okay, but soon slide into a silence that neither side could pierce. Harris had almost given up on the idea of having a family of his own before he saw the ad. Now he had hope. The other men who'd joined base camp seemed resigned to the idea of marrying. Martin Folsom, the eccentric billionaire who was funding the whole venture and whose idea it was to create the reality TV show documenting it, had made it very clear marriage was required. The hooking up aspect was what drew crowds to watch the show, and Folsom was nothing if not dedicated to creating publicity for the venture. None of the other men seemed to look forward to marriage the way Harris did, though. Maybe they were keeping their feelings to themselves, but Curtis Lloyd, a burly man with a normally cheerful temperament, had been the latest one to draw the short straw that meant he was required to marry next, and he hadn't been cheerful about that at all. Harris supposed he couldn't blame the man, given the circumstances. It was strange enough being on a television program that required you to marry, but it was even stranger to find out you had to marry someone you'd never met. Clay was the one who'd originally drawn that short straw on the day after Boone and Riley's wedding just over a month ago. But while Clay wanted to marry Nora right from the start, she'd been reluctant before her stalker attacked her. Back then, when it wasn't at all clear to Clay that he could convince Nora to say yes before the deadline was up, he had agreed to let Boone find him a backup bride to marry. But he'd made Boone agree not to bring her to base camp or tell anyone anything about her until his time was up. After Nora was attacked by her stalker and nearly killed, everyone agreed it wouldn't be fair to push her to marry Clay or to push Clay to marry someone else either. Faced with a looming deadline for the television show, the rest of the men had drawn straws again, and Curtis had picked the short one. He'd been furious. "I thought I was going to get to choose my own girl," he kept saying. "I didn't think I'd get Clay's leavings." When Boone had tried to show him Samantha Smith's photograph and bio, he'd waved them away. "What good will it do me to know ahead of time I won't like her?" he'd burst out. "You're forcing me to marry her no matter what." That had been a very uncomfortable 48 hours at base camp. They'd managed to keep the tension hidden from Clay and Nora, thank goodness, so it was a surprise to everyone when Nora rallied at the last minute, the very day before the deadline. She and Clay had married in a matter of hours, and Curtis, realizing he'd been given a 40-day reprieve, had partied harder than anyone else last night. "You saved my ass, man," he kept saying to Clay whenever he bumped into him. "I was due at the altar to marry some loser Boone caught trolling the internet. But you beat the deadline. I've got 40 more days, and I'm going to put them to good use, starting tonight." From what Harris could tell, Curtis had hit on every female guest at the wedding. He wasn't sure if he'd had any luck, but Harris was certain the man would be nursing a hangover the size of Montana today. So would everyone else. Which meant no one had thought about the backup bride. Harris exited his tent, zipped the flap shut behind him, and made his way to the bunkhouse where he got a pot of coffee going. Pouring a mug and heading back outside to the fire pit where they ate many of their meals, he sat down on a log and pondered the situation. Boone had mentioned the woman's plane was due in early this morning. Before Clay and Nora's wedding, the plan had been to hold a small ceremony just before noon today and host a lunch to welcome the backup bride to the community. With Nora struggling to get over the attack, Clay so worried about her, and Curtis so unhappy about stepping into his shoes, no one had wanted to make a fuss about the wedding. Now there didn't need to be a hasty wedding. Harris had overheard Boone explain the situation to Reverend Halpern last night, so there was no danger of him turning up again. Harris wondered what would happen next. Maybe Curtis would fall for this Samantha Smith after all once they'd spent some time together. But what if he didn't? What would happen if Curtis refused to marry her? Would Boone find a backup bride for the backup bride? What would happen to Samantha? Harris skimmed an eye over the quiet campground and the empty pastures beyond. He thought about waking Boone to remind him it was time to go fetch the woman, but Boone deserved the chance to sleep in with his wife. He'd taken a lot on his shoulders when he'd helped found base camp. A natural leader, the others looked to him for direction, which left him in charge of the bulk of the responsibilities. Harris was fine with that. He'd had his time of being in charge, of being the man everyone else depended on. He was happy to be one of the followers now. "Harris Wentworth, just the man I've been looking for." Harris nearly dumped his coffee in his lap and bit back a groan as he realized who had spoken. Renata Ludlow, the show's director. A sharply dressed, 30-something Hollywood type whose mannish tailored clothing contrasted with her scarlet lipstick, heavy mascara, and the lacy bra that peeked out from the V of her buttoned shirt. She was notorious for her skewer-sharp questions. She was followed by 3 camera crew members who looked like they'd drunk as much last night as some of the wedding guests. What the hell were they all doing up this early? "You've been avoiding me." The director shook a finger in his face. "Time for an interview." "Not now." "Yes, now." Her tone brooked no disagreement, and Harris knew he was well and truly trapped. This was part of his job, to talk about what he did. He didn't think he'd ever get used to it. Spending your days being followed by people wanting to film your every word and move was as hellish as it sounded. "Fine. Shoot." He drained his coffee and stared straight into the camera. He knew they all hated that. "Harris! Harris!" Renata snapped when he didn't divert his gaze. "Oh, for fuck's sake, have it your way. Look like an ignorant prick on the show." That made him look at her. As much as he didn't want to admit it, he didn't want to look like an ignorant prick. "So, Harris, Curtis Lloyd says you've given up on finding a wife in the normal way, and are looking forward to having one assigned to you. Why is that?" She made a show of scanning him top to bottom. "You're a handsome devil. I bet you have a way with the ladies." Damn Curtis for throwing him under the bus. Harris tamped down his rising anger and simply shrugged. Aside from staring at the camera, it was the best way to rile up Renata and her crew. "Use your words, sailor." No, Harris thought. He wasn't going to use his words. He wasn't in the Navy anymore, and Renata couldn't give him an order. He shrugged again. She narrowed her eyes. After a long moment, she said in a silky tone, "Tell me, Harris, do you think disaster follows you?" Harris blinked, then cursed himself for letting her get to him. "Can't say I've ever thought about it like that." "You were 10 when Hurricane Andrew hit Florida." She cocked her head. "You were already the man of the family, weren't you? Where did your father go?" Harris shrugged again. Who knew? He certainly didn't. "You saved your mother and sisters." He shifted. That old story. "I didn't save anyone." They'd done what any sane person would do, spent the duration of the storm in the trailer park cinder block recreation building with the rest of the tenants who couldn't or wouldn't evacuate before the storm hit. It had easily withstood the driving winds and rain. Nothing else had. Harris had rescued his family, but not in the way Renata meant. He'd never forget walking out of the building into the wasteland the storm had left behind, or the way his mother, Adriana, had collapsed into a sobbing heap not 20 paces from the door. He'd left his younger sisters clinging to her and raced ahead to examine what was left of their home. Trouble was, he couldn't find it. It was completely gone, along with every possession they'd owned, including the beater Subaru his mother drove to work at the laundromat, and the $350 she'd squirreled away behind one of the trailer's paneled walls for a rainy day. It had taken weeks before they could make their way to family in New Orleans, and during that time, Harris had been the one to find food and water, the one to get them to the emergency shelters and sign up for aid. He'd been the one to wrangle a phone call to his aunt and uncle and persuade them to wire money for bus tickets, and he'd kept his grieving mother and terrified sisters safe until they pulled into the Greyhound station in New Orleans and were met by their kin. Normalcy had returned, although it took years for his mother to get over that storm. The four of them had settled into one room at his aunt and uncle's house. His mother and sisters shared the double bed. He slept on a foam mat they tucked away underneath it each morning. When she wasn't working at the corner store where Aunt Olivia had helped her find a job, Adriana spent hours on the little house's front porch staring into the distance, seeing nothing. Harris was the one to make sure his sisters made it to school. He was the one to remind her to buy them clothes, go in and talk to the teachers, make them get their homework done. Aunt Olivia did her best, but she had 4 kids of her own to raise, along with a full-time job. "You were 23 when Katrina hit," Renata said, breaking into his thoughts. As if he'd ever forget. 5 years into his service, he'd come home on leave to see his family and make sure his sisters were walking a path that would get them out of the kind of poverty and desperation they'd grown up in. So far, it had been working. Della was already at LSU with a full scholarship. Belinda was starting 11th grade with straight A's and a slew of after-school activities. He was so proud of them and of his mother, who, despite her fears and struggles, always held down a job and did her best to keep the girls on the straight and narrow path. They should have gotten out. He'd wanted them to evacuate. But by then, Uncle Manny was in a wheelchair with a crushed hip, and the 9 members of the combined 2 families still at home depended on one Chevrolet Cavalier to get around. No way they could pile into it for a drive that might take days, let alone carry the food and clothing they'd need for the trip. No way Uncle Manny could bear that much time in a car, anyway. His aunt refused to leave Manny behind, and Adriana refused to leave her sister, no matter how many times Harris urged her to take Belinda on one of the city buses and get out of town. "The dikes will hold," Uncle Manny kept saying. Of course they hadn't. "Tell us what happened," Renata encouraged in a low voice. She must have seen the traces of his memories on his face. "I got them to the roof, kept them safe until help came." "Which took days," Renata prompted. Days, nights, a nightmare passage of time that still haunted his dreams. The water had risen so fast he'd nearly lost his uncle before he'd gotten the rest of them to the roof. He'd had to dive under the rising water in the narrow stairwell to rescue Manny from the bottom of the stairs, where he'd been waiting his turn in his wheelchair, and drag him up into the attic, out a window, and onto the roof, his sisters, cousins, and aunt screaming and straining to get him up over the eaves trough. He'd spotted his nephew's inflatable beach boat on the way out, grabbed it, and used it to rescue neighbors, strangers, even a couple of cats and dogs. "I did what I could." "You saved 27 people that day, counting your family, and in the days following, you kept them fed and alive. You're the kind of hero this country needed during that disaster. What kept you going through that nightmare?" The memory of the 4 awful days before help finally arrived hit Harris like a punch to the gut. The water, the heat, the smell, the bodies. During the long hot days, he'd foraged for food and water as best he could. At nights, he'd perched on one end of the roof and kept watch, crouching there, straining to see and hear as screams and shots rang out in the distance from time to time. Someone had thought to grab the bug-out bag his uncle, ex-soldier that he was, always kept stocked. Manny had handed him the revolver and ammunition it contained that first day. "There was a time I'd be the one keeping watch and saving lives. Now it's on you," he'd said. Harris had kept that revolver near to hand until rescue finally came. On the fourth morning, he must have been sleeping just as dawn broke, because it was as if he had stepped out of his body and watched himself watching the hushed, watery world that surrounded him. In that instant, he'd known this was his fate, not just for those few days, but forever. To be the watcher, the man on the edge of the roof, the man who saw danger before anyone else, the man who took care of it. In his dream or vision or whatever it was, he'd seen himself on one end of the roof, everyone else on the other end, and he'd known that was the price of his family's safety, his country's safety. He would be alone. "Do you think those early experiences led you to become a sniper?" Renata asked, as if reading his thoughts. He met her gaze, nodded. Of course it had. "Not much need for a sniper around here." Renata gestured to the bunkhouse and the little sustainable community taking shape on the hillside a stone's throw away. "This is Chance Creek, Montana. Pretty safe country here." Harris swallowed. Renata knew damn well that wasn't true. "Tell that to Nora." Guilt flooded him, the way it did every time he thought about the stalker tracking Nora down, playing with her, leaving clues they'd all been too stupid to acknowledge, and then snatching her out from under their noses. The truth was that when Harris arrived at base camp, he'd told himself his vigil on the rooftop was over, and he'd behaved like it was. He'd looked forward to being found a wife, marrying her and starting his family, finally getting to be one of the crowd at the other end of the roof. And 3 people had nearly died. Harris wouldn't make that mistake again. Trouble was, he didn't know what to do. Keeping vigilant meant keeping apart from other people, and in order for base camp to succeed, he would have to marry when he drew a short straw. The way this game went, 10 male inhabitants of the sustainable community had to marry within the year. 3 of the wives needed to be pregnant before next June. If he left the community, they'd be up Schitt's Creek. If he stayed, he'd be going against the future fate had obviously picked for him. As soon as things calmed down around here, he meant to take his conundrum to Boone and sort it out. Renata sighed. "You don't want to talk about Katrina? Let's talk about your nickname. Hawk, isn't it? So, Hawk, tell me, what kind of woman are you hoping to marry?" Harris stood up, unable to take any more questions. He'd always hated that nickname, and he'd left it behind when he'd left the Navy. "I'll marry who I'm assigned to marry," he said tightly. "Now I've got to go." Renata's face lit up. She obviously sensed an interesting development. "Where?" Hell, he couldn't tell her. She dragged the film crew along to the airport, and the last thing Harris wanted was to break the news on camera to the backup bride. She wasn't getting married today. Renata would love it, though. She'd make sure to get a close-up of Samantha Smith's disappointment. She'd pray for tears. Harris wouldn't be any part of that. "Nature's calling," he said bluntly. "Want to film that?" Renata rolled her eyes and made a chopping motion with her hand. The crew stood down, and Harris headed for the bunkhouse, which held the only flushing toilet in base camp. He bypassed the restroom, though, walked straight through the kitchen and out the side door. 5 minutes later, he'd managed to take a circuitous route to the main road where he called a cab on his cell phone. He walked along the country highway toward Chance Creek, knowing sooner or later he'd meet up with the cab coming to fetch him, and mulled over the irony of the situation. He'd wanted to stop looking out for everyone, and here he was taking charge again, solving another problem, keeping an eye on things as if he was the shepherd of this operation, rather than just one of the sheep on the comfortable end of the roof. He didn't know why he fought against fate. He was meant for vigilance, meant for being alone. When her plane landed at the Chance Creek Regional Airport in Montana, Samantha Smith found she couldn't make herself leave her window seat. She let the other passengers file by until the plane was empty and the flight attendant made her way over to her. "Everything all right?" A blonde woman about 10 years older than Sam, the flight attendant's expression was kind but tired, and Sam felt bad for holding things up. "I think so. I'm making a big change," she confessed. "I guess I'm nervous." "What kind of change?" The woman helped her gather her things as Sam finally stood up and made her way into the aisle. "I'm getting married today." Sam still couldn't believe it. She'd always been the steady one in the family. Now here she was taking a flying leap into matrimony with a man she'd never met. "Congratulations. I hope you two will be very happy." "Thank you." Reluctantly, Sam moved up the aisle toward the exit. So far, things hadn't exactly gone smoothly. She'd made the decision to join the sustainable community at base camp without telling any of her family, and she had to admit she was more than a little concerned with the fact the first man she'd been matched with, Clay Pickett, had turned out to be in love with someone else. She'd gotten a phone call from Boone Rudman, the SEAL who seemed to head the community, who'd matched her with Clay to begin with. He'd apologized profusely and explained the whole story of Clay's rocky relationship with his new wife, Nora, but told her another man was ready to take Clay's place. She still felt strange she'd been matched to a second man in such a short period of time, but since all she had to judge the men by was their photographs and bios on the show's website and what she'd seen of them when she'd watched them on TV, she decided the friendly, stocky Curtis Lloyd seemed just as likely a partner as the slimmer, more serious Clay Pickett. But the switch had dampened any flight of fancy she might have had that her marriage was ordained by fate, and she was having trouble maintaining her original excitement for this mad adventure. "Have a wonderful wedding day," the flight attendant said when they reached the top of the stairs. "Watch your step going down, and kiss your husband for me." Sam nodded, her nerves twisting tight in her belly. She gripped the railing, shifted her purse and carry-on bag into her other hand, and began to descend to the tarmac. It had all started with her mother's craving for hummus. They'd been halfway across Kansas in the Big 12 sleeper bus they'd long since dubbed the Evermobile, an amalgamation of her parents' band's name and the fact they never seemed to leave it for very long. Sam had been driving, as usual, when her mother rushed up the aisle, waving an empty container in her hand. Sam, we're out of hummus again. I told you at our last stop we needed more." Sam pressed on the accelerator and tried to block out the sound of her mother's voice. It wasn't hard to do since the noise level in the 1998 sleeper coach had just hit a high mark. She'd been driver, tour manager, advisor, and den mother to Deader Than Ever, a popular 60s hippie-esque cover band for the last 7 years, and she'd grown up on this bus and its predecessors since she was a baby in her mother's arms. She would have been born on one, but they'd made it to the hospital on time. For someone who'd been surrounded by music since she was conceived, the irony was she hadn't been gifted with a drop of musical talent. Her parents, Rachel Flick and Henry Smith, had passed her instrument after instrument, sung her song after song, allowed their friends to try various methods of imparting musical knowledge, and finally had given up, much to Sam's relief. Her sister Melissa had talent enough for both of them, and the same stadium-sized ego their parents had. That was enough of both for one family, Sam always thought. Besides, someone had to have their head on straight in this zoo. "Sam, did you hear me?" Rachel reached the front of the bus and waved a plastic container in Sam's face. "There isn't enough in here to spread on a rice cracker. We need to stop." "We're in the middle of Kansas, Mom." Sam pointed out the window at the fields of knee-high cornstalks spreading in every direction around them. "When there's a place to stop, I'll stop." Rachel huffed out a breath and turned back toward the kitchenette. Sam kept driving, pressing down against the discontent that sizzled inside her all the time these days. She was sick of the bus, sick of being on the road, sick of the temporary gigs and housing they parked themselves in between tours. She didn't understand how the rest of her family could ride along day after day, their enthusiasm for the life and the road unflagging. Her parents had toured for years before she'd even been born. "It's the best life," Rachel always said when she asked. "It's the only life," Henry always added. "Everyone's equal on the road. There's no patriarchy out here," Rachel liked to insist. "Just a whole lot of freedom. What more could you want?" Freedom. Sam didn't define the word the way her family did. Her parents seemed to think it meant a lack of commitments of any kind, a lack of responsibility, too. Never married and never exclusive to each other either, as far as Sam could tell. They'd met when the band formed, and Rachel had signed up as a backup singer while Henry played guitar. They'd loved each other, brought 2 daughters into the world in 2 years, and raised them together while each pursued a number of dalliances and relationships that left Sam bewildered, Melissa wild, and both of them cynical far beyond their years. Sam had never been able to play those games, and her dating life could only be summed up as a disaster. She spent her days in the company of musicians, roadies, and fans, but none of them were interested in long-term or stable, the only thing she wanted from a relationship. Now she was 27, single, fed up. "Don't suppose anyone's going to deliver us a pizza out here?" Sam glanced over her shoulder and saw that Chris Castle, the lead singer, had taken the nearest seat. "I don't think so." "I'll whip something up and back. That should keep the grumbling down." She nodded. Chris always read a brewing situation right, whether in the bus or in a stadium, and always worked to defuse it. He was the opposite of a diva, she thought. There should be a word for that. "Everything all right, Sam?" She knew he expected her to say yes, like usual, but she couldn't, not anymore. Things weren't all right. This was never the life she'd wanted for herself, and she didn't know how she'd gotten here. Time was slipping by like the cornfields outside her window. "Sam?" He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder. She shook her head. "No, it's not. I'm going to leave pretty soon." She didn't know when or where she'd go or what she'd do. She'd never had any life except on this bus. "I know, honey. I've been wondering for a while what you're waiting for." "I need a plan. I don't know what to do first or where to go." She tried to keep her eyes on the road. She couldn't take chances driving a rig this big. Chris squeezed her shoulder and stood up. "Stop overthinking it. You don't need a plan. You need to throw yourself into the mix and let the universe sort it out for you." He patted her shoulder a couple of times. "I'll bring you dinner in a few." Let the universe sort it out for you, Sam thought when he was gone. Far easier to say than to do, at least for her. But she was willing to try it if it got her off this bus. 2 hours later, after the night driver took over, Sam was sitting on a bench seat with her laptop perched on her lap, sending follow-up texts and emails to all the upcoming venues on this leg of the tour, when everyone else piled into the bus's media area. She was only halfway through her list when Rachel turned on the big-screen television and turned up the sound. Sam tried to concentrate, but as music blared into the small space, she lost her place and had to reread what she'd written so far before she could finish the sentence she was trying to type. A narrator's rich tones overlaid the quasi-patriotic song ringing out from the television. "Welcome to Base Camp, where 10 men must pit themselves against time and technology to build a model sustainable community. They must build 10 houses that consume 1/10 of the power of a normal North American home. They must create a renewable power grid from which to run all their appliances, lights, and machines. They must grow all the food they'll need to last through the winter. They must each marry before the year is up, with 3 babies on the way, or risk losing everything." By the time the announcer finished the ridiculous list of goals, Sam was watching the screen with as much concentration as everyone else. "What is this?" she asked her father. "It's base camp." There was no mistaking his contempt. "Apparently the U.S. military is going to solve global warming, if you can imagine that. 10 Navy SEALs getting together to form a sustainable society." "This show is the patriarchy's wet dream," her mother called from over her seat. "Just watch the way these men give each other orders, and see what they're making the women wear. It's straight out of the Dark Ages." "Out of the 1800s, you mean? And they're wearing those clothes because they want to. Now shh," her sister told them. "This is the best part." "Meet the men of base camp," the announcer intoned. One by one, men flashed up on the screen, their images subtly enhanced to make them look like comic book superheroes. "Look at them," Melissa said. "No one's that buff. The military probably got them all hopped up on steroids." Sam ignored her sarcastic tone. Those men were something, she had to admit. Each more handsome than the next, although it was the 5th man they showed, one named Harris Wentworth of all things, who made her breath catch. It wasn't his bulging muscles, she told herself. It was something about his eyes, the way they seemed to scan the distance for trouble. That's what she always had to do, whether it was scanning the road ahead for actual danger or thinking about the future to avoid potential pitfalls on tour. When the announcer had told through all the men, he said, "Meet the women of Westfield." The background, which had showed a cluster of tents and a building or two on a Montana ranch, now changed to show a beautiful old stone house perched on a rise of ground. "Wow," Sam said. That was some house. She could only imagine what it would be like to live in a place like that. Everyone would get their own room, a room with a lock. They could shut the door, turn the key, and be blessedly alone for hours. Her mother turned on her. "Can you imagine how wasteful it is to live like that? Just a handful of women in that great big pile of stone? Can you say white privilege?" "I can say privacy, white or otherwise," Sam told her. "You might as well dig up all the coal and oil in the world and set it on fire if you're going to live like that," Rachel said. "Wait a minute. You got mad at the army guys living in tents and tiny houses a minute ago. You can't be mad at the women for living in that house, too." "Navy guys," the drummer put in. "They're Navy SEALs, not soldiers." "Whatever. You can't have it both ways, Mom." "I'll have it any way I want to. They all should be ashamed of themselves." "Shh," Melissa said again. "Watch." "Wait, Why are they dressed like that? Sam asked, leaning forward to get a better look at the women appearing on screen one by one.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?